This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today we're going to talk about deliberative democracy, which is a little different from the way we practice democracy every day. Deliberative democracy is an old idea. In fact, it's an idea that goes back to the Greeks about individual citizen participation, about citizens reasoning with one another, and citizens making decisions not because they've been appointed to a job, but because they have a duty as a citizen in a particular moment. We will talk more about this. It's an idea that is old, but is also new and getting more and more attention, especially from young scholars and young political activists who, like so many of us, are dissatisfied with the practice of democracy as we see it in our world. We are really fortunate today to be joined by a young scholar who is working on these issues, someone who's been highly recommended to us. And it's always great, not just to have experts and old fuddy-duddies on the show, but also to have young, spry, new activists and thinkers. And so today we have Gryffin Wilkens-Plumley. He's a senior at Yale University, and he spent a lot of time working, as he says, as a deliberative democracy designer. Gryffin, welcome to our show.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
A little more background on Gryffin. He currently works as a project manager and design lead for the Connecticut Citizens Assembly initiative at the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. That's a mouthful. It's an initiative to hold the first ever official state-level citizens assembly in America, and we're going to ask him about that. Griffin's work focuses on citizen governance, designing assemblies for independent citizen governance, and working with funders and elected officials to turn designs into reality. And so we're going to talk to him today about his work and what deliberative democracy is. We're also joined, of course, with my partner in crime, Mr. Zachary Suri. Zachary, how are you today?
Hello. I'm here. How are you?
We're glad you're here. Are you excited to talk about deliberative democracy?
Yes, should be very interesting.
Yeah, it'll be a chance for us to deliberate, right, Zachary? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want us to start, not with a poem today, but with some words from one of my favorite philosophers, who I think all of our listeners know, William James. He was a leading thinker, writer, intellectual figure of the late 19th, early 20th century, and he wrote a bit and spoke a bit about democracy. And in 1897, he articulated some really, really interesting and important words for us. This is William James, 1897. The nation blessed above all nations is she in whom the civic genius of the people does the saving day by day, by acts without external picturesqueness, by speaking, writing, voting reasonably, by smiting corruption swiftly, by good temper between parties, by the people knowing true men when they see them, and preferring them as leaders to rabid partisans or empty quacks. I've always thought that's a really interesting way to think about democracy. Gryffin, does that overlap with some of the concepts at the core of deliberative democracy for you?
I think it does, and it doesn't in different ways. What's funny about that quote, just as an initial reaction, I'd not heard it before, is that a very similar version of that quote, I think, could have been said by Rousseau or even Aristotle if he was feeling more pro-democratic that day. The issues that we have with what in Greek they call demagoguery are as old as we can feasibly imagine. And I think that makes sense because we today, our psychology, our strengths, our foibles as people are the same in essence, in a fundamental way, as those of the ancients.
And maybe just say a little more about that. Why are we prone to demagoguery? Why don't people just naturally, when they go to the ballot box, vote for, as James says, the best person?
So that would be my more cynical critique of what James says. I don't think that what we should be striving for in a country necessarily, though of course it would be lovely, is that everyone resist demagoguery, everyone of their own accord resist partisanship, and just out of sheer strength of character, overcome all the structural incentives that lead normal, well-meaning, reasonable people in countries across the world in various different contexts to various similar behaviors. I think that partisan governance in particular is always going to be set up to incentivize these sorts of polarizing behaviors. It's a little bit better with proportional representation, where one can have multiple parties in government. But particularly for countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and others that use a winner-take-all system for the election of their legislators, i.e., you don't get to elect multiple people to a House district, that means that any rational voter, after a few systems, this is simple game theory, after a few systems, they will only ever choose one of two options. And that is why governments of this type almost always, unless there is very, very strong sectarian or regional or sectional division, they will almost always tend to have two dominant parties. And furthermore, on the idea of demagoguery, most people, when they are interacting with politics in what we'll loosely call a democratic state, what I prefer to call a representative state, they are only interacting with it, I think, as Rousseau would say, every 4 years they are free. Every few years, they go to the ballot box and they have to make a decision, but otherwise, they're not really involved. They take all of the responsibilities and they take the consequences of political decisions as surely as they pay taxes and drive on the roads and have or do not have health care. But they're not deeply involved in the process of the specific decisions being made. And so what is a lot easier for someone with only a casual and discontinuous relationship with politics, what's a lot easier to get into is a common human psychological system of us versus them, of what we today would call team sports, what could be considered in other times dueling houses or religions or various other ways that people can split themselves and form narratives that are very compelling and make sense and can simplify very, very complex policy issues, which none of us have time to be educated on, into binaries or trichotomies or however many parties may be in the state.
Got it.
I've been talking for a while.
No. That's actually very helpful in understanding your critique of representative democracy as we think about it. Zachary?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what do you see as the alternative, Gryffin? I know you've worked on a lot of projects around deliberative democracy, both in Europe and here in Connecticut. What does it look like when you're designing deliberative democratic projects?
Okay. So I'll start with the structure, and then I'll start with the psychology. The structure of it is pretty straightforward, though of course there can be infinite variations. The structure is that you invite a large number of people, large enough that the law of large numbers applies, and you ensure that they are representative in various ways of whatever population you're trying to represent. This is familiar to most of us. This is how scientific studies and regular polls, good quality polls, are conducted. Now, what's different here is they are not simply asked their opinion on an issue. That would just be a poll. The reason for that is we do not think that it actually reflects the will of the people to say, hey, citizen so-and-so, on this day after you've been at work for 8 hours and your kids are screaming at you and you haven't shoveled the driveway when you really wanted to, and you're upset because your sports team did not win the most recent match, what's your opinion on this particular policy issue that you may or may not have heard of? And if you have heard of it, you may or may not have read about it because you're busy. What we're trying to do with deliberative democracy is to answer the question, what would the people decide to do themselves if they had, like legislators, access to the time, focus, expertise, material support, and access to each other to deliberate face to face to try to work on these issues together. What would they then choose to do? And what you find, and this started with deliberative polls in the late 80s by Professor James Fishkin at Stanford, what you find is actually double-digit swings of people's perspectives on issues before deliberation and after. You also tend to find much more considerable compromise among the assembly than you would often have if it was simply this party has 51% of the votes and they pass it. You also tend to get more consideration for long-term consequences than you do in a politically elected assembly. Now, why is that? And this is where I'll get to incentives. When a politician, an elected politician, comes into an elected assembly, they are thinking about, of course, they're thinking about the good of the nation, but they're also thinking about how are they going to be elected again? How do they win re-election? How does that interact with their constituents? How does that interact with the party that they are within? When a citizen is invited into this assembly and is given this civic responsibility and is given, usually for large assemblies, about 8 weekends spread out over months so they can think in between, their only incentive is, what sort of future do I want to live in? And if they're a parent or considering it, what sort of future do I want my children to live in? Because they have no other means of getting any sort of gain out of this assembly. They will not be reelected. They will not be paid handsomely, and they will gain little to no social clout. And so in that way, I think that it both puts the correct people, that is to say, the population themselves, as nearly as we can represent them, into the room to ask what their interests are. And it gives them the right incentives to be, in a way, selfless, and in a way, perfectly selfish, because they're just being asked, how do they want to live? How do they want their kids to live?
Zachary, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Gryffin, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but how do you avoid, in selecting these assemblies, simply reflecting the prejudices of the populace? I mean, it's certainly true that our elected leaders display a lot of prejudices and a lot of, pathologies that make our politics what it is today. But it's not clear to me that the people don't also reflect that. And how do we avoid creating citizen assemblies that simply bring out the worst in the people?
Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking, Gryffin, just to follow on Zachary's question with a real historical example, if you had citizen assemblies in Mississippi in 1952, or for that matter in Texas in 1952, they would have affirmed Jim Crow laws.
Those are really good points, and I appreciate that. I will answer that in 2 ways, and I'll start with Zach's question. When it comes to the prejudices of the people, that's a real concern, and I understand why that's a concern. I think there are a couple factors that tend to moderate that, and may actually moderate them to the extent that they end up, I will say, better here being less prejudiced than elected assemblies. One of them is the role of experts in the assembly. Experts are brought in very purposefully in the education stage. Usually in these assemblies, they have been brought in by an expert governance committee that existed before the assembly on this issue to try to bring the best of the best. I'm trying to design a system where maybe we start with that, but then after that, the citizens themselves have some choice on how to select their experts, because I don't want bias in the system. But we can talk about that later. And what you tend to find is that citizens are well aware of the fact that they are not experts on most of the issues that are addressed by citizens' assemblies. You find often that they are much more humble about what they don't know relative to elected officials who, honestly, on some of these issues may know just about as much as the regular person, but because of the stature of their position, they can tend to be, I'll say, more arrogant. They can tend to ignore the advice of experts more. Now, the other side of that is the face-to-face action of it. One of the best ways consistently to reduce prejudices in general is to bring people face-to-face and to have them learn to live with each other. This is part of why, potentially, we tend to see lower rates of racial hatred in urban cities with very mixed populations versus very ethnically homogeneous rural communities. And that effect happens very quickly at a high intensity in an assembly process. It's very hard to, for example, put down the disabled community, when by necessity there will be representatives of that community in the assembly who will have equal right to speak as you, and whom you will be speaking to at some point in time personally in a face-to-face way. Humans have a kind of natural sympathy, and I think that assemblies like this can actually overcome a great deal of prejudice in that way. Now, to the example of the Jim Crow South in Mississippi in the 1960s, I would concede that it is certainly possible. I never know what will come out of an assembly. If I did, it would be a bit of an illegitimate process. What I would say is I think that especially in the Jim Crow South, if African Americans and European Americans were being represented fairly and proportionately to their population, you would have a very well mixed assembly. It would not be possible to carry on the business of the assembly without dealing with the fact of all this mixed conversation. And actually, we don't need to go back in time to think about this. Assemblies like these are happening across the world, and they are happening in regions with serious divisions, religious divisions, ethnic divisions, linguistic divisions even. And what we find, and you can go to Professor Fishkin's work about this as well if you're interested, is we find consistently lower rates of prejudice among assembly members after the assembly. And we also find that for the most part, people are able to carry on the business of the assembly regardless of those prejudices. And I would venture the hypothesis that it's precisely that necessary normalization that makes such a thing possible.
So that's really helpful, Gryffin, and help me to understand and our listeners then how these assemblies really work. Let's start from the beginning. Who participates? Because clearly your vision would be, therefore, a participatory assembly in a place. It could be contemporary Serbia or 1950s Mississippi, where people are in the assembly who are not voting, and they're therefore part of the deliberative process in a way they wouldn't be if we had a normal representative vote. So who participates? How do they get selected? How does that work?
Okay. So I want to make a slight semantic distinction between participatory and deliberative democracy.
Okay.
And that has to do with essentially self-selection. Participatory democracy, I would think about a New England town hall or perhaps an open school board meeting where it is open to the public and anyone can come. This is very common and very popular in the progressive movement in the United States in the earliest 20th century, as I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the issues that we have with this, and that anyone who has interacted with municipal governance probably has experienced, is you tend to get a very self-selected set of groups who actually come. One could say it's usually the squeakiest wheels who come. And to some extent, it's good that people who care, their voice is heard. And that's a matter of free speech, and I wouldn't want to infringe on that. However, in the assembly, I think it's a unique and special benefit that you are not selected to the assembly, let's say on climate, because you're a climate activist or because you work for ExxonMobil, we'll say. You are selected to that simply on the basis of being a resident of the state of whatever state is holding that assembly. And it is up to you to think not about what your particular activist or industry or other perspectives are, though there may well be activists and industry members mixed in with the assembly proportionally. You are there just to think about the issue from your own perspective and the perspective of the citizens in general. So I'll make a distinction there. Now, how does this work? I'll give you a simplified process, a pretty standard process. So I'm not going to give you the ideal case, the case that I'm more trying to design now. I'll give you how it generally works. So how it generally works, especially in Europe, is that some official body, usually a local government or a national government or even the European Commission. I got to observe a citizens panel run by the European Commission. They will convene this process. They will employ their secretariat to begin designing this process. They will subcontract it out to a deliberative democracy designing company. For example, Mission Publique, the company that I worked for the past 2 summers. And then they will drop a design. There will be months of design work going back and forth between the commissioner and the designer. You can think of this almost like a client and an architect. And eventually what they'll come to is once a venue is decided, a number of weekends are decided, a budget is found, they will collectively appoint a governance committee. This governance committee is usually 10 to 12 experts. They will usually be experts in different things. Depending on the institution, you may have some representatives from the commissioning body. For example, you may have in France the Economic and Social Council, the CESE, will often have their own representatives on that board. And they're just going to be there to work with other experts to design an initial education packet, to decide what the overall schedule is going to be for however many weekends. And it's usually weekends because you're asking for regular people's time, whatever that schedule is going to be. And then during the assembly, they don't run things from the front. There are usually facilitators, professional and neutral facilitators who run things from the front. But they are there to deal with complaints from the citizens, to deal with, the news is attacking us. How do we think about how to defend that? Or, the president of the republic has decided that he wants to talk to one of the citizens. We should ask the citizens and put it to a vote how they're going to select who will talk to the president of the republic. Whatever sort of eventualities. Now, during that time, there will be a separate process, usually by either the contracted company or the secretariat of the commissioning body, to run a stratified random sample. Stratification criteria vary a lot by assembly and by country. In France, for example, you are not legally allowed as the government to ask for the ethnicity of the citizens. So they run by other things. They do it almost always on gender, almost always on socioeconomic level, almost always on educational attainment, and almost always on geography, because we don't want to overrepresent urban versus rural and Northwesterners versus Northeasterners and so on and so forth.
So Gryffin, that's super helpful, and it leads to my next question, which I guess is at the core here, right? I mean, you argue very persuasively, I've seen elsewhere that, and other scholars of deliberative democracy, that it allows reasoned debate and discussion and for people to make reasoned decisions in the context you've just laid out so well, as they wouldn't otherwise. Why is that? And explain to us why you think the people who have now been brought to this deliberative assembly, why they will make better, more open-minded, reasoned decisions.
Oh, I'd be happy to. So there's multiple reasons for that. But let's consider the alternative. originally, the theory of deliberative democracy had more to do with how do you make society in general more deliberative. And one of the models that you have there is the idea of a track one versus track two deliberation, where track one is normal political governance, what we'd imagine, say, happening on C-SPAN. And track two is the conversations that people have with each other and in the media and by the water cooler at work and so on. And where the track one was very organized, and you had speaking times and you had representation systems. Track two is very chaotic, and especially in the modern era, track two is very, very liable to get siloed. It's very easy for us to only interact with people who agree with us, only interact with people who have a similar background to what we have. And that's precisely, all of that is inverted in an assembly. In a citizens assembly of this kind, you will be meeting people who represent, in a small picture, the larger picture of the whole population of whatever polity we're talking about. You will be talking to people who are in trades that you do not deal with. You'll be talking to people with vastly different experiences than you. You'll be talking to people of very different education and parental raising and so on. And because of how the assembly essentially forces you, there's restriction and there are rules in the assembly. You are forced to interact with other members. You are forced to speak equally, to give up your time when you've had your time. There are rules for the deliberation. There are bounds of civility that are enforced by the members or by the facilitators, rather. And the importance of all these rules, which can seem restricting, are actually to make the assembly and the most members there free. My professor, Ellen Landemore, she likes to point to the quotation that says, "Democracy is like a jolly hostess. She wants to bring the shy people out."
Yeah.
And that's exactly what these assemblies do. It's really remarkable, the reports that come out of people who said, I'm shy. I've never really thought about politics because that's not really for me. At the beginning, I didn't really feel like I had a right to speak about this or like I should raise my voice. And at the end, people are much more acclimatized to it because they've been expected to do it. And they're able to actually talk with each other and say, hey, I hear what you're saying about your perspective on this, but this is how that would work in my life.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. In the European Citizens Panel on tackling hatred in society, I got to observe a subplenary discussion from people all over the 27 member states, and ranging from ages 16 to 78. And they were trying to think about the specific idea of how to run a public ad campaign that would hopefully reduce hatred in society, reduce hate crimes. Now, what was interesting is that the older members were preemptively trying to meet the younger members in the middle. They said, hey, I understand that most communication nowadays is digital, so I think we should have ads in the digital space. And in turn, the 16-year-old and the 17-year-old replied, well, that almost makes sense, except I and everyone I know have an ad blocker, and we're not going to see any of those ads. And even if we do see those ads, we will never pay attention to them. And we know from the education and talking to the experts that we've been talking to that it's vast majority young people, our age group, that are committing these sorts of crimes. And so what they came to is actually the best way to reach young people in particular and everyone in the society more broadly is physical ads. Physical, traditional, old school ads on big poster boards at train stops and bus stations and all these sorts of public facilities that people would be using. And that is what ended up going into the final recommendations of the assembly. And so I hope that example in a nutshell could show why I think this can lead to really wonderful, well-reasoned discussions, especially because they are not trying to win. They're not trying to win re-election. They're not trying to win for their party. They're just trying to come to some sort of solution that makes sense for the people in the room.
Yep.
And I think that's the heart of what deliberation is supposed to be. I think ideally that is what the framers of our own Constitution had in mind when they were designing the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's not their fault that this is one of their earliest attempts to run a large republic, and they were doing it at a time with far less sophisticated statistical methods and certainly far less sophisticated communication and transportation.
Yeah, no, I think this is the vision for the Senate in particular that the founders had as a great deliberative body, as they called it. Zachary, I think Gryffin has really painted a detailed and vivid image of what deliberative democracy could look like, and he's made it sound very practical for us too. As we close, what do you think, Zachary?
Yeah, I think this is a very compelling case, and I think it's a wonderful project that Griffin's working on, and I'm looking forward to see what comes of it. I think the most important part of this to me is the idea of engaging ordinary people in the work of democracy and trying to find and reach out to those people who might not be the first in line to vote or the most vocal in our political realm, and trying to get them involved in the process too. I think that's something that we can forget when we're talking about, the rough and tumble politics of our world.
Yeah, I agree. And it also encourages the reasoned behavior that we hope would be at the core of deliberation in a democracy. I think, Gryffin, what you've shared with us and what the work you're doing, and I hope you continue to do it, and I hope many of our listeners will get involved. I think it reminds us that there are many forms of democracy, and democracy is an ever-evolving set of institutions and practices.
Absolutely.
And it's our duty as citizens like you to be working on helping to evolve our democracy to deal with the contagions and diseases that seem to be breaking it down right now. Final question, Gryffin, where can listeners go to find out more information? What are the top one or two places you'd suggest that they should look?
Ooh, okay. There's a lot of great institutions out there. So on the general idea, I might go to actually a British institution, the Sortition Foundation.
Okay.
They can give you a better idea of the...
Spell that for us.
So Sortition, Sortition. It is the word... It's the word used to describe the random selection of political actors, especially in Athens. So they're proposing sortition to be the basis rather than election. They are a great resource. There's also, in the spirit of democracy, there's a Wikipedia type site called Participedia, spelled how you would expect. And that is not run by sanctioned experts or anything, much like Wikipedia is, but it has a great variety of different things that you can look at. And what I'd point to especially are the real life examples.
Yeah.
I got into this and this idea when I was in high school because of the example of, for example, the Irish Citizens Assemblies, which preceded the referendums and put forward the idea to the parliament that, yes, they should alter the constitution to grant abortion access and grant same-sex marriage. They also have been continuing to do assemblies. It's become somewhat institutionalized. They run them on climate as well. In France, we are on the third Citizens Convention. Part of the problem you'll have here is that different countries will have different terminology. Generally, in English-speaking places, they will call them citizens' assemblies. In French-speaking places, they'll call them citizens' conventions. And at the European level, they've decided to call them citizens' panels, even though they are still made of about 100 to 150 members.
That's terrific. That's terrific, Gryffin.
Just quickly. I'm so sorry. Let me be indulgent. They're in East Belgium, which is small.
Wow.
It's a few thousand German-speaking Belgians. They are actually instituting a system for permanent deliberative assemblies to decide the agenda for their parliament, for their legislature. And so it's called the Ostbelgian model. And for a look at what a more institutionalized and permanent version of deliberative democracy might look like, I would look at that.
Gryffin, you've given us so much to chew on. You've given me homework and many of our listeners, and you, I think, inspired us to think about other forms of democratic practice, particularly deliberative democratic forms. And really, this is important work, and we hope to have you back on in the future when you can talk about more of the work that you've done. Thank you so much, Gryffin.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you, Zach.
Yes, thank you, Zachary. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for another week and another set of Substack posts on This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.